So be sure to subscribe to our channel and also like this video. Also share this video with your friends. Now let's back to the video. He supposed the first word out of his mouth had not been mommy or daddy, mainly because they never said any such words to him as a young child, but a more endearing word. Hungry. It was something they understood, being hungry, and though the blonde toddler had not said the word right, they still understood what he meant. Stealing goats had become tiresome, and the human child had long ago begun to show signs of wanting more than just goat milk. So they had to feed him something with more substance. The four demons hovered over the naked toddler and contemplated on what to give him. Sorn, of brown earthy skin and blood-encrusted jaws, said they should have done what they had wanted to do in the beginning and eat the child. Spate, being the youngest of the group, the same race of demon as the others but smaller in stature, crooned against the idea as always, claiming their human pet could be useful one day. Crick, the self-proclaimed leader, not by size but in brains, agreed, however mostly because he alone had spent countless hours licking away at the seal that covered the infant's stomach, trying to draw out the master demon that he sensed just below the surface. Ka showed nothing of his opinions, whether he just didn't care or had some other agenda, they did not know. What they did know was that they were hungry, and like the human child, it was time to eat. Crick scooped the toddler up in one large hand, as the others shifted on their large clawed feet before leaping into the trees. Crick glanced down at the blonde human child, grimaced at its baby-fine hair that he spent so much time licking, to his blue eyes that his own yellow one spent so much time gazing into. The child really had potential, he knew this, even when he occasionally wanted to eat it too. But that's what made him smarter than the others. At least Sorn and Spate. Tka remained an enigma. It was time for the human child to enter a new chapter of its short existence, a rebirth, so to speak. He was about to ascend to the very top of the food chain, because for their kind, there was nothing tastier than the flesh of humans. Their diet consisted of all types of meat, from insects to bears, and they would eat just about any animal. But human flesh was the delicacy they dared eat, and Crick could smell the demon somewhere hidden in this pale pink body. The greater demon, a master beyond what they were, and such greatness deserved the flesh of humans. After so much time spent licking the seal until the child's skin began to chafe and become raw, he was rewarded with a certain understanding. The less human things the child did, the weaker the seal became. Crick brunched his powerful haunches, gripping the toddler in one hand, and made a leap into the trees, heading for the next human encampment. They were going human hunting. Hunting humans was always a risky ordeal, since humans for the most part are intelligent creatures. Of course, there were the humans that were stupid enough to eat, and those were the ones they always got. When it came to human hunting, they always managed to get at least 3 to 4 of them, because it was easier to use the lure in a wider scale than to focus it on one individual. The lure was the use of their first and secondary vocal cords, sending out sound waves at 2 different octaves, one like a drone, and the other at a frequency too high for the human ears to hear. The higher octave was riddled with subliminal messages, usually consisting of the same sentences, "Come into the forest, something is there. Something amazing." The lower, more audible drone was for their actual ears, so that it was easy to get more than one prey when they all could hear the same sound. Often enough, they managed to attract the male humans, due to the fact that human females were much more cautious, and males being much more curious of the unknown. The day they were outside a small settlement of humans that worked the earth, which was perfect for hunting, because young human males often wished for adventure and intrigue that their dull earth-working lives had so far not provided for them. Crick, Tka, and Sorn hovered just behind the forest edge in the copse of trees, singing the lure and waiting for their food to walk up to them. Spade hung back with the human child, who now knew how to walk, even though he spent more of that time crawling. Forest terrain was not a steady flat surface, a toddler needs to learn the ways of moving upright. He was only about 2 human years now, and was still as dumb as they were at that age. Immediately he was attracted to the call. Though his brain was still too smooth to understand the subliminal messages, he waddled from behind Spade and carefully picked his way on unsteady feet to where the call was coming from, slipping around some brush and nettle to make his small sojourn. Finally, he came upon Crick, whose powerful jaws were open and giving off the wonderful noise. Feeling something soft at his knee, Crick glanced down and seemed startled to see the human child standing next to him, blue eyes upon him and waiting. "Spade," he snapped, breaking off in his lure. "Get the human child away from here, you wastrel." Spate rushed forward and grabbed the toddler, heading farther into the trees. Moments later, 5 humans appeared, eyes wide and pupils dilated. "Do you hear that?" one youth asked, staring straight through the hungry Crick. The other humans made no reply, only continued to walk forward. Ka and Sorn stopped singing, allowing the humans to leave the trance. Eyes widened, mouths opened, lungs filled with air, and the screaming commenced. Grumbling to himself, Spate glanced down at the human child that sat on his foot, gnawing on a twig with eyes riveted on the thicket where screams of terror and pain arose. The toddler was used to hearing these noises since the pack had always taken him on the hunts, whether it be animal or human. The child was also growing teeth, only two so far, but enough that it felt that it had to chew on anything that didn't move on its own. Spade lifted his head and sniffed at the bloody aroma that wafted in the air and hoped that the others would bring his share soon. As if summoned, the others came through, Tka holding two corpses, while Crick and Sorn carried one each. Tka dropped the human in front of Spade, who hungrily grabbed a meaty leg and pulled it from the rest of the body with an audible pop and tearing. The human child stopped chewing on his twig as he watched the others tear into the bodies, powerful jaws crunching down on bone and sinew, blood dripping down necks and on naked chests. They were eating. Hungry, the child gurgled, drawing Crick's attention. The word was barely understood by the demons, simply because the child did not have the vocal cords to say most of their words. The language of the demons could be called guttural, angry, sharp and impossible for a human to repeat due to the fact that the words were often laced with clicks, hisses, and many other sounds while words were being said. Words that were impossible to say without a second set of vocal cords. But the child had managed hungry because it was more of a growl, and Spate said it often enough that the human child managed to pick up its meaning. Crick picked up the torso of his own meal and scooped out the heart with his talons, completely ravaging the chest cavity of the human. Dropping the body, he sauntered over to where the toddler sat and dropped the heart into its waiting hands. The child was puzzled. Usually it received the white warm liquid that it had enjoyed so much until not too long ago. Now it craved something more. But instead of getting what it expected, it got a large warm red oozing thing that was sort of heavy. The child blinked and glanced up at Spate, who by noticing the toddler's gaze, scooped out his own heart and slowly bit into it. All yellow eyes on him, the toddler lifted the heavy muscle to his small mouth and began to gnaw on the heart. Then continued to gnaw. Satisfaction. The child had tasted flesh and approved. He would live, Sorn was loath to agree, but the evidence was secure, as was now the child's life. The blonde child never went through the terrible 2 stage, but it leaked over into the terrible 3s. His 3rd year of life marked his great change, and the fact that he was finally significant in the pack's lives enough that they got tired of calling him the human child and wanted to give him a proper name. So what to call him? It was hard to give the human a formidable or intimidating name due to the fact that at 3 he couldn't scare kittens. Something endearing was out of the question, for there was no way they were going to call him something cute. Spate stood amongst them as they crouched in thought, all of them racking their brains for a suitable name that wouldn't make them gag or snicker. His hair is like the sun, Ka murmured in deep thought. Too shiny. Crick looked up at the sun that shimmered above the canopy and grinned. Then it settled. We will call him Sun. The others managed a grimace, though their facial structures allowed limited movement, and sighed in agreement. Crick stared down at the naked toddler that sat in the middle of the circle, staring and attempting to touch a brown spider that crawled amongst the leaves in a frantic flurry. Son. The blonde child looked up and grinned at them. He had more teeth now, enough that he didn't have the urge to gnaw on everything that fit in his mouth. He did still have the habit of putting things in it though, but they were pleased enough to know that he was quick to figure out what disgusted him. Peppermint leaves were a joy, while wild raspberries were a nightmare. He enjoyed spiders, crickets, grasshoppers, and butterflies when he was quick enough to catch one, but absolutely hated snails and slugs. Sun was improving daily, intellectually and physically. He spent more time walking than crawling, but still had a few major faults that irked his caretakers. As demons, it was in their biological makeup that all food consumed was used or else stored as energy in case later needed. This allowed them to go weeks without food and remain healthy and not suffer from malnutrition. It also meant that they did not create waste, did not urinate or produce fecal matter. But Sun did on a daily basis, managed to crap where he sat and piss where he stood. It was a nightmare for them, even with 2 years' experience. It was worse for Crick, who spent more time cleaning and taking care of Sun than the rest. The only solace he had was that he was aware that at some time in the human's lifespan, they began to clean up after themselves. He just didn't know when. Another thing that annoyed them was Sun's need to sleep. They didn't need to sleep, their body was constantly trying to work at optimum level. Their only need was that for a few hours a week they needed to sit and relax, loosen up the body and preferably not move. Not doing this could lead to energy depletion, which could be catastrophic. The only time they did lose consciousness was if they were badly hurt or knocked out. But Sun spent many hours of the day sleeping, and if he wasn't sleeping, he was annoying them. All day was spent climbing on them, pulling on their arms and legs, soiling himself, and saying hungry and other pointless half-formed words in their language. After a time they settled into the knowledge that they would probably spend a decade with his human behavior. The only thing that separated Sun from other humans was his ability to consume raw meat without suffering some type of ailment. Sun ate the humans and animals they provided for him with a gusto, even if they had to mash some of the tougher meat in their jaws before they gave it to him. Things were difficult at times, but Sun had settled into their lives and was less a burden and more of a pack member. But on a rather cloudy morning near the end of the season where the leaves turned orange, brown, and red, and the snow falls from the sky, things began to change. It started with his apparent agitation as he tried to sleep while they rested amongst the great elk trees in a rather non-human area of the country. Sun tossed and turned on the pile of leaves he was laying on. Soren glanced over to see the toddler toss and turn, rubbing his eyes and looking incensed by something. By morning, they turned to see the child sitting on his pile of leaves and staring at nothing. He usually was playing or bugging them about food. His eyes were now watery and red-rimmed, an unhappy headache had clearly mounted along with an earache in both ears. His nose was stuffed and his throat felt raw and ached terribly. Sun rubbed his eyes and felt hot tears cascade down cherubic cheeks. "What's the matter, Sonny?" Spade asked, knowing that half the words the child would not understand. But as he said them, Sun gave a shriek and covered his red ears, bawling in misery. Crick came over and sniffed the child over. "What's wrong with him?" Soren asked, coming over to inspect the whales. "Has he come down with some human ailment?" "Oh no," Crick murmured as he watched the toddler crawl away from them. For an hour he remained that way, his back to them as he silently cried, and even ignored their calls when Crick brought the carcass of a doe to the area so they could dine. Another hour went by when the coughing started, dry, ugly, coughs that made the small body spasm and shudder. Crick returned to him and wondered at the scent of blood. Was the child injured? Perhaps he was suffering from some type of human infection. He knew that if a human was injured and did not treat their wounds, they reddened, oozed, and stank until the human suffered from fever and dies. That was why they always killed them quickly when they intended to dine. Leaving a human alive for any period of time always attracts attention. Crick grabbed one of Sun's chubby legs and lifted the toddler upside down, examining his pink naked flesh for some kind of wound. But all he found were small scratches from branches and twigs, all of which were well on their way to healing. "Oh," and a very upset toddler. Sun squawked and began to cry loudly, loud enough to annoy their sensitive ears. Between the wails and the hacking coughs, the pack was beginning to feel pretty nervous over the toddler. Crick gently placed Sun back on the ground and began to notice that along with everything else, the child's eyes were beginning to swell shut and he was wheezing. Ka lowered his head to the small chest and grumbled, "He's having a hard time breathing." "Maybe he is dying," Spate murmured mournfully, and the pack lifted its head collectively and stared at Crick, waiting for him to make a decision. Crick's eyes remained on Sunday. "We'll wait a day. If he shows no signs of recovery, I'll lure a human here to fix him." He then scooped the wheezing child into his arms and cradled him, something he had never done before. But he had seen human females do that to their young in hopes of comfort. By the next morning, Sun had stopped crying and coughing altogether, but his eyes were swollen shut, his ears were bleeding, and they barely managed to get water down a throat that was almost swollen shut. His skin was flushed hot, but after a time he had stopped shaking completely and simply lay limp in their arms. During this time, they managed to find a cave that a bear was going to hibernate in. Crick ate the massive beast alone, for he needed the extra energy for the sprint he was about to make over the many leagues it would take to make it to the nearest human settlement. The only thing Yumi regretted in a life full of good things was that she was unable to attend the Stone Ninja Academy and become a medic nin like she had dreamed. Her father could not afford much after her mother had died, and the romantic that he was would not allow him to remarry. But the income of one person, there were many things the two had to go without, and though it was much too late to start that kind of training now, she had to admit she still harbored secret desires of becoming a shinobi medic. But now, at 19, she was ready to leave the nest and get at least the medical training she desired, even if it didn't include molding chakra. Gods, how she wished she could use such skills as she had seen one day when some injured stone shinobi had come through. Seeing their medic nin run a hand along her teammates' wounds had been awe-inspiring. Oh, how she wished she could do something like that. Yumi smiled. The second best thing to do was hit the capital and learn at a real school. Most of her teenage years were spent apprenticing to local herbalists, apothecaries, bonisitters, and anyone who knew a thing about the human body. Hopefully all the knowledge she had gained during the years she could have spent frolicking or at least acquiring a boyfriend was going to be useful. Yumi packed the last of her bags and turned to her father, who was leaning in the doorway, weathered face twisted with pain and happiness. "Oh daddy, don't give me that look. I'll be back in no time." Her father was taking her departure a little harder than she had hoped. "No," he said with a dramatic sniff. "Your old man will be alright. He'll just let his little angel fly off into the horizon, never to be seen again." Yumi sighed and gave him one last hug. "Don't be silly, Dad. I'll write every week so you'll know what's up. And I'll try to visit during the breaks." "I'll be alright," she said as she pulled away from him. "Trust me." Bakezo sighed and rubbed his grizzled cheeks. "It's not so much that you'll be leaving as you'll be making that long dangerous trip alone." Yumi blinked in surprise. "No, I'm not." Shiro is also on his way to Stone. He's going to escort me on the way. Yumi glanced down at her watch. Which reminds me, I'm late in meeting him. Well, in that case, her father said with a laugh as he began to push her towards the door, don't hesitate to write. Bye, my little butterfly. Yumi chuckled as she threw him a quick kiss and ran down the steps, her packs jingling on her back. Bye, Dad. She called, waving at him as she ran down the road towards Shiro's house. She took a deep breath and exhaled in excitement. This very moment marked the beginning of a new life, anew. Please help. Please help me. My child is dying. Yumi spun on her heel, eyes darting around the dusty street. Only a few people were out, going about their business and not paying her any mind. What? Her brain tried to process the call. Someone's child was hurt. Someone please help me. I don't think he'll last any longer. I need a doctor. That was her call. As if only her feet knew where to go, Yumi charged down an alley, jumping over discarded boxes and dodging trash cans as she emerged onto a street and continued her mad charge toward the source of the desperate call. She barely even noticed as she left the village and raced past Farmer Ito's rice fields. It wasn't until a branch smacked her forcefully in the face that awareness returned to the woman and she collapsed painfully to her knees. Sucking in great gasps of air, she vowed never to run that way again. She couldn't ever recall running so recklessly in her life before. Yumi turned and made sure her pack full of clothing and medicinal objects were still with her as she rubbed her stinging cheek. Stupid branch. Yumi's head snapped up, brown eyes widening as she took in the thick forest area surrounding her. How in the hell? A large thump behind her startled the youth as she spun around. She gasped. Finally. A human had responded to his call. Using the lure to capture one person was tricky, using the lure to capture a person with specific traits was hard. He wasn't sure if he would attract just one person or several people who practiced the art of healing. But lucky enough for him, he managed to capture a talented female, one which was already packed and ready to go. The female must have responded to his call immediately because its brown hair was tossed around its person and a sheen of sweat had graced its pale skin. However, that could possibly have something to do with his presence. Crick did not have time to waste. Reaching out and grabbing the small female by its arm, he winced as the human started to scream in terror. A quick knuckle to the head, shut it up quickly, and Crick swung it on his broad back. The trip back was going to be annoying, but hopefully this human would make Sunny better. If not, they will eat it. If so, well, they would still eat it. Shiro approached the door nervously and knocked, switching feet as he waited for Yumi's father to open the door. There was a grunt, then the sound of locks being released, and Takezo's weathered face and body appeared as he blinked blearily at the youth. Shiro? What are you doing here? I thought you were going to escort Yumi to Stone. He rubbed his eyes and came fully awake. Shiro glanced nervously behind himself and swallowed. Yes, about that. I was hoping that Yumi was late and that she was still here, but judging by the blood that was draining from her father's face, that was a negative. But she left 2 hours ago, he whispered, eyes beginning to glaze over. Shiro rubbed her forehead and sighed. She never showed up. He had to quickly catch the older man as he slumped to the floor. Yumi awakened and was surprised by that fact alone. She expected that her scream had been her last breath, her last anything, and yet here she was, awake somehow on the cold stone ground. She grunted and shifted, realizing her left arm was numb, so she pulled it out from under her. Blinking several times, she managed to sit up and brush the hair out of her face to inspect her surroundings. After about 2 seconds, she wished she had stayed unconscious. She was sitting in what looked like a rocky cave, a rather large one in fact, that rose quite high with rocky fissures and the like. She was sitting near the mouth of the cave and could see surrounding forest about her, almost concealed by a heavy sheet of rain that made the view a dreary gray. But that wasn't what upset her. What did was the 4 monsters that stood about 20 feet from her. They were about 9 feet in height, with brown leathery-like skin and round yellow eyes. Their arms and legs were long, their hands and feet large, and laced with claws that looked like they could rend flesh easily. They had short muzzles that did little to hide the large pointy teeth that lay within them. Surprisingly, they wore some type of loincloth that almost blended with their skin, so thankfully she didn't have to know what gender they were on first glance. But did it matter? They were obviously going to eat her. Yumi held back tears. One moment she was heading out to fulfill her dreams, the next staring death in the face. Where did she go wrong? She knew one thing though, this would surely kill her father. Wiping away angry tears, she glared at the beasts and noticed that they weren't moving. Their eyes were on her, but they did not blink or twitch one of those sturdy muscles. They seemed like statues, frozen and inanimate. Then one, who was slightly behind the others, shifted its head and took a step forward. Yumi crab-walked backwards frantically and gave a shriek as she stumbled over her packs. Why the hell were those here? She was sure she had left them there on the forest floor. But now the monster was walking toward her. She noticed how its clawed feet made no sound as it moved. Yumi backed all the way to the far wall and bumped into the rocky interior, too terrified to scream this time. She vaguely noticed that one of its arms was curled toward its chest, as if the arm were somehow injured as it hovered a foot from her, yellow eyes seeming to study her worth. Then it moved the curled arm and Yumi gasped in shock. Curled in the nook of its elbow was a baby, or maybe a toddler, with wild blonde hair and pale skin. The child lay there limply, as if dead, and Yumi felt a hot rage she had never felt before consume her. This is what they did to their victims. Show them dead children to drive them mad, then kill them. Lacking caution in her anger, Yumi grabbed the toddler and almost dropped it when she felt how hot the skin was. It was alive. Grabbing a small chubby wrist, she put her index and middle finger against the vein and listened for a pulse. It was there, steady yet slow, much too slow for a toddler. Quickly looking the child over, she saw that it was a boy, one in poor shape. She dropped into what she hoped was a doctor mode. The child's eyes were swollen shut, there was pus around both ears, hinting of a severe ear infection. The toddler's throat seemed dangerously swollen. She hoped it wasn't strep throat, and it was cutting off the boy's ability to breathe properly. He also seemed to be suffering from a high fever. First things first. After categorizing the child's ailments, she decided that decreasing the swelling of the throat would allow more oxygen in the blood, which, despite the other pains, would at least ease some of the child's misery. She pulled off her shirt and wrapped the boy in it. She had some good tea leaves that reduced swelling and eased the pain of sore throat, and she was grateful that her pack was sitting near her. She blinked. Was it possible that they had not brought her here to eat her, but in fact nursed this boy back to health? She looked up at the monsters, noticing the one that had given the child to her had returned to its previous position. They were all staring at her still unmoving statues, and she wondered. Was this child theirs? Had they stolen it from some poor woman to eat and decided to care for it instead, only for it to become ill? Yumi shook her head. Priorities first, luxury later. First she needed some water. Pulling out the small pot she had packed for traveling tea breaks she was supposed to have with Shiro, she carefully placed the unresponsive toddler on the cold rocky ground and slowly headed for the cave entrance. Showing the monsters that she wasn't intending to run away. Their gazes followed her, but they made no moves. She quickly filled the pot by using the sleet of rain that fell along the rocks, knowing that any minerals in the water would be welcome. She made sure there was no sand at the bottom, then headed back toward the child. At her pack, she pulled out some tea bags and a small red cloth. Setting the pot down carefully, she slowly gathered rocks and some dry sticks and bramble that she found and placed them together. She then looked at the 4 monster statues. I'm going to need fire for the tea, she said in a steady voice, and inwardly cheered at how calm and cool she sounded. The statues continued to stare at her, uncomprehending or not caring either. She did not know. Fire? She repeated hopefully and cupped her hands to her mouth and blew on them, as if she were cold, which she was with no shirt and all, and then placed them over the sticks and rocks, pretending to warm herself over them. She did this several times to the point where she was to despair when one of their heads moved. The statue at the corner shifted and then it said something to the others. How she knew it was actually speaking and not making random noises she did not know, but she had no hopes of repeating anything it said to the other statues, whose heads began to shift toward it in response. I think it wants us to build a fire, Spate said, turning to look at the others. Crick was obviously resting due to his mad dash across the country and back to find a healer for Sunny, and wasn't inclined to reply. Tka and Sorn both looked at him with obvious annoyance, though less with Tka. Well, go build it a fire then. Stop wasting time, Sorn snapped. Spate resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Just because Sorn was older than him, he always felt the need to assert his authority all the time. It was annoying, and one day, when he was hopefully larger, he would have to teach Sorn a lesson. One that hopefully would leave scars. Spate sighed and took a step forward, noticing the human backing away. The human was a temptation for them, except for possibly Crick. It smelled good, and its fear was tantalizing. Nothing smelled better than a frightened human. Humans understood pain and death better than animals, or perhaps differently because they feared both more than, say, an elk would. An elk knew when its time was up, knew when to stop fighting. Humans didn't. They fought, they screamed and they cried, they refused to give in to the endless night, and that's what made them taste better than any other living creature. Yumi backed up quickly as one of the monsters stepped forward. Was it going to kill her? Yumi watched nervously as the monster bent lower to the ground and sniffed her sticks before it straightened itself and moved a massive hand over the sticks. Yumi watched in unconcealed fascination as the monster clicked its thumb claw and index claw together in a type of snap that produced several sparks. It did this several times before a small spark managed to ignite, and Yumi bravely came forward to nurse the flame, gently adding sticks and all the while knowing that the monster had not backed off. Then she felt a movement and glanced up to see that it had returned to its position with the others and became still again. Dropping the tea leaves into the pot, she set it on top of the rocks that sat amongst the flames and left it to heat up. In the meantime, she cradled the toddler and hummed a lullaby she had heard some of the village mothers sing to their children. She caressed the child's golden hair, marveling at how soft it was, and began to wonder how long the statues had the child. There was no sign of malnutrition, and the child was reasonably clean, with small scratched here and there that she could tell were from sticks and twigs. Maybe a few days. But no, she could tell they must have had the child for some time. 1. They would not have gone so far to find a healer if they didn't really care about the toddler. How she knew she was far from home, she did not know, but she could feel it in her bones. The sound of sizzling water brought her out of her thoughts. She set the child down and pulled out some cups and a spoon. She picked the pot from the fire and poured the tea into the cup. Then she went to the entrance again and filled the hot pot up with water. Immediately the cold water began to warm. Returning the child, Yumi sat him upright and dipped the spoon into the tea, gently blowing on the liquid to bring down some of the heat. Opening his mouth with 2 of her fingers, she slipped the warm herbs into the child's mouth and hoped it went down the right way. The child coughed, the first sign of life it gave in the first hour, and scrunched its cute face in pain. I know, she cooed. But mommy's going to make it all better. She inwardly marveled how easy it was for a woman to drop into mother mode, even when days ago she would have sworn she wasn't ready for any type of child. But it was so easy to care. An hour later, most of the tea had made it down the child's throat, and the obvious results were pleasing. The swelling had gone down drastically, along with the fever that was plaguing him. Yumi resisted the urge to do a victory dance, pleased that she had killed 2 birds with 1 stone. With a less pained throat, the child began to whimper often and shift miserably in her arms. Step 2. With the warm water from the pot waiting, she dipped a small red cloth into the pot and began to run the warm cloth over the child's body and face. Wiping his eyes, which were also gummed shut, she grimaced. Hopefully he didn't have some type of conjunctivitis or some other serious eye infection, because she didn't have any sterile antibiotics for them. The only thing she could do was clean them up so the boy could at least open his eyes, or try to since the flesh was swollen. For his ear infection, which was now probably the only thing that was making him miserable, she could do a little more, and after cleaning them out, she managed to pour some medicated water into his ears, causing him to cry and squirm, though she held him still. All the while, she kept a close eye on the 4 statues, whom hadn't moved even when the toddler cried out in pain. Did they really care? Or was it that they were used to the cries of children? How intelligent were they anyhow? Smart enough to see through your pantomiming, her brain said, and she conceded to the thought. They obviously had their own language, which said pretty much everything all on its own. After wrapping the toddler in another of her clean shirts and donning one for herself, she pulled out her camping futon and rolled it out, scarfed down a nutrition bar, since she didn't want to make anything else, and zipped both her and the toddler into it. What shall I call you? She murmured, staring at the toddler. Some of the swelling in his eyes had gone down, though to her chagrin, she had seen that most of the blood vessels in his eyes had popped, leaving them a gruesome red. Would they kill the boy if there was any lasting visual damage? Hell, would they kill her? Yumi tossed the grim thoughts aside and began to wonder again what to call the boy. Let's see. If you were my baby, I would call you Now. Yep. For now, your name is Now. She kissed his forehead and curled up around him. She glanced at the monsters, who had not moved once, then shut her eyes, safe in the knowledge that at least for tonight, she was safe from death. It only remained to be seen if tomorrow was going to be as safe as today had been. She wondered how long she had been unconscious from the time she had been kidnapped to the time she had awakened. Was her father already missing her? Was Shiro? Were they looking for her now, wondering if she was safe and unharmed? Except for a pulled muscle, she felt great, if a little spent. The onslaught of rain was comforting, as was the small warm body she held. Yumi drifted off to sleep, unaware of the 4 hungry gazes that fixated upon her. Ka sniffed Sunny as he stood over the human female that had curled herself around the toddler. Turning from them, he made his way around the small fire and nudged a few sticks into it when he noticed that it was almost going out. Sunny smells a lot better than before, he murmured as to not awaken the sleeping humans. I must admit, your choice in a healer is admirable. Crick pulled himself out of resting and nodded. It was very rare for Tka to compliment him in anything, since Tka was wont to keep his opinions to himself. If anything were to happen to him, Tka would take over the pack in his place, and he was sure that Sorn would behave himself. Spate, he did not worry about. Out of the 4 of them, he was the most amiable and adaptable. Though it seems strange, Tka whispered suddenly, that Sunny's scent is beginning to change. I sense a darkness about him. He smells less human now. Crick lifted his head and sniffed the air through slitted nostrils. Yes, the seal must have weakened due to Sunny's ailment. Already he could sense the source in him, that strange ability that made some humans dangerous and the greater demons masters. He suspected it was already flowing through Sunny's body. They only had to wait and see. The next morning was pleasing for Yumi, who awakened to see a sitting toddler attempting to eat her hair. Sitting up, she examined Nao. The swelling of his eyes had gone down, leaving them rimmed pink, though the vessels in his eyes had yet to heal. Getting a hold of his head, she examined his pink ears and thought that maybe another dose would do well for them. Yumi glanced up and noticed that only one monster remained, the one she was sure had made the fire for her, and it was staring at her like they all had yesterday. Turning back to Nao, she opened his mouth to check his throat when she shrieked and moved away, fear rolling through her. Nao had the teeth of perhaps a 3-year-old, but they were sharp and dagger-like. Yumi felt cold. Had she mistaken this whole ordeal the whole time? Was the child perhaps a monster too, only it hadn't reached the stage where it began to look like the others? Was one of them its mother, perhaps the one that was staring at her intently, nostrils flaring occasionally? Yumi focused on Nao's eyes and noticed things she had ignored before. What she had assumed were bloodshot eyes and popped vessels now appeared to be crimson irises and slitted black pupils rimmed with an orange fire that threatened to pull her into them. Gentle flushed cheeks sporting curious markings now seemed sinister and animal-like, perhaps whiskers. She noticed red agitated ears somehow seemed more pointed, and chubby little hands now had small sharp fingernails. This child wasn't human. In fact, if Yumi really looked, she would realize that Nao was no longer sick and was actually in high spirits. He made a strange clicking sound from the back of his throat and reached a small hand toward her foot, deadly eyes cheerful and strangely innocent. When she had awakened, Nao was attempting to eat her hair. What if it was more than just child curiosity? What if Nao ate humans along with the rest of them? Yumi glanced up at the monster that stood across from them, really looked into those yellow slitted eyes, and realized how hungry this monster looked. I think I better leave, Yumi whispered, feeling terrified. The toddler turned and crawled over to Yumi's pack and began to dig into the contents, picked up a spoon, and experimentally chewed on it. The sound of twisting metal came unwelcome to her ears, and Yumi staggered to her feet. I'm going now, she said between gasps as she stumbled toward the entrance. The boy is alright now, so I'm gonna go home. She glanced at Nao, whose crimson eyes were staring after her curiously and gnawing on the now mutilated spoon. Why, you can keep my stuff. I don't need it. As she made it to the entrance, the monster made a move toward her. Yumi screamed, turned, and fled the cave. It happened so quickly. One moment there was jagged rock under her feet, the next she was falling, crashing into everything, feeling pain in every bounce, until there was a loud snap in her ears that blocked out all sound and she could no longer feel herself fall. Only the world twisting end upon end. Then she stopped falling and the world righted itself, the sky stopped whirling. It was partly cloudy today, but the sky was a beautiful change from the dreary cave ceiling. There was a ringing in her ears that wouldn't go away, but she knew not to move until her body accessed the injuries first. Strangely, black dots began to appear in her vision, popping up and disappearing, only to show up again. The face of the monster appeared above her, and she could have sworn there was a complete look of surprise on the gruesome features, like it had not expected this. More black dots appeared, and slowly Yumi began to understand what happened, and mostly, why she not only hadn't got feeling back, but couldn't move. The cave had been at the top of a rather steep rocky hill, and she hadn't known that, seeing as at the time she had gone to the cave entrance, it was raining very hard. That loud snapping noise must have been her neck breaking, and these black dots that increased must be signs that she was dying. She felt fear, wanted to cry or perhaps hyperventilate, but her breaths became shallow, her own heartbeat, which was the only thing she could hear, became slower. Most of her vision left, except for the two yellow glowing eyes which took up what was left of her sight. It was a pity this was the last thing she was going to see. Odds she wished she could see her father. This was going to kill him. She wished she could have been a medic nin, like her mother had been. Then the eyes were gone and darkness came. Spade hovered over the human female, watched as the warm brown eyes began to lose focus as they stared at him, and then its breaths become short and few. Then it stopped breathing and became still, eyes becoming glassy. This was completely unexpected. Spade hadn't a clue as to why it had its flight of terror, since he hadn't done anything to warrant it. But it had run and managed to kill itself in the process. The smell of its rich blood oozed out of the many broken bones and gashes it had accumulated on the way down. Especially from the neck, where the bone had snapped and was protruding out of the flesh. The scuffling alerted him, and Spade turned to see Sonny carefully make his way to his side, metal object still in his drooling mouth. Spade frowned. How did the clumsy child make it all the way down here when he had trouble walking on a flat surface without falling on his face? What happened? Sonny asked suddenly, startling the older demon. Sonny had just said two words almost perfectly in their language, with the right hiss on happen. Spade stared closely at the toddler and noticed the changes. Sonny was making the clicking noise that was commonly associated with curiosity, while his now sharp teeth gnawed on the metal utensil. His now slightly pointed ears were twitching at new or enhanced sounds, and his small button nose was twitching at the smell of blood. But the most noticeable trait was the crimson eyes and slitted pupil that was ringed with yellow and orange. And then it all made sense. Swollen eyes for the change, swollen throat for added vocal cords, bleeding ears for the enhanced hearing, and the brief moment of stuffy nose for the enhanced sense of smell. Sunny had not been sick as much as simply going through the change Crick had once whispered of. So was the human female necessary then? Had they really needed it then? Seeing the crimson eyes upon him, Spate felt inclined to answer, though he wasn't sure how much the child would understand. It is dead. It broke its neck. He pointed to the piece of bone poking out of the female's neck. Sunny stopped chewing on the piece of metal and stared intently at the corpse, body gone still with thought, unnatural for a child. Why? He said suddenly, and Spate started in surprise. It was not an empty why, but a why did she die, which meant that Sunny understood the concept of death, which was impossible at his age. But he was moved to answer. Terror. Terror makes a thing a fool. Sunny remained still, and perhaps thoughtful, as he stared down at the human corpse. What happened? A voice inquired, and Spate turned to see Crick calmly approaching the scene. Not too far back, Soren and Ka carried a large fat female bear. Crick stood near the body looking annoyed. Spate shrugged. I don't know. It suddenly grew frightened and ran and killed itself on the way down. But look, Spate said as he saw Crick grimace and Soren giggle. Look at Sunny. He is well again, and more like us or at least like our kind. Crick looked at Sunny, who was staring absent-mindedly at the corpse, chewing away at the piece of metal in his mouth. Sunny, Crick called, and the crimson eyes looked up at him expectantly. You will do well here. He then turned to Spate. Take the human female inside. We will dine on her cold flesh along with this healthy bear we have found. Spate nodded eagerly and picked the human up by its damaged neck. He watched as Crick picked Sunny up by the legs and sniffed him over before trudging up to the cave. Be serious, Spate, Soren hissed with a malicious giggle. You killed the human so you could eat her. Spate scowled in reply and headed up to the cave, human female tied in one grip. Only Ka stopped and picked up the piece of metal that Sunny had dropped when Crick picked him up. He then headed solemnly towards the cave. He'd been the only one, he was sure, to say that they should let the human female go once Sunny was well. Soren had blatantly disagreed, saying that they shouldn't let such a meal pass them by. Crick had been indecisive, since he was more concerned about the safety of the pack if they let her free. He was sure Spate had wanted to eat the human as well, but if Crick wanted to let the human go, Spate would have backed him up immediately. Such was his loyalty. But now the human was dead, by mere accident, and Ka felt they no longer had any choices. Alive or dead, their fates were sealed. None of the others knew that he had agreed with Soren the first day they had come across Sunny in the forest. They should have eaten him along with the human he was with and be done with it. He alone felt the sense of death that surrounded the infant, that if they let it live, they would meet such a gruesome end. But Crick had wanted to keep it, Spade had backed him up, and Soren had shut his mouth. He had not opened it at all. Maybe he should have. Maybe by his own silence he had sentenced them all to death. Ka sighed and entered the cave, seeing Crick divide the human up and give a severed hand to Sunny, who chewed on it hungrily. He still liked to chew things. Well, it was all too late now. Sunny was no longer exactly human, he was part of the pack, and the human was dead. Best to meet this straight on. He accepted the human thigh Crick tossed his way. Bekezo stood stony-faced and shadowy-eyed amongst his late wife's friends, former teammates from when she had been a medic nin. Each one had held Yumi at least once during the time when she was a child, each one had been called a guardian of some sort. Now they had gathered to find Yumi, who had disappeared. One shinobi held a scroll in one hand, he claimed that he would summon a pack of wolves who would be able to hunt Yumi down. Bekezo handed his wife's hit-eye, which no longer smelled of her, but Yumi, who used to wear it and pretend she was a medic nin. They would find his daughter or exact vengeance on the ones who had killed her. 4 and 5 were more pleasant years for Sunny, the years of learning and self-discovery. He was now able to walk and run without falling all the time and found that he enjoyed climbing trees and traveling by them. Which was a relief for the pack since normally they spent little time on the ground. But since the day they had found Sunny, they had to change most of their lifestyle to accommodate the fragile human infant. They were grateful that Sunny seemed to be evolving quickly since the change when he was 3. He was now able to leap from tree to tree, support his own weight, and capture his own food, though his diet only consisted of smaller animals and insects, and the occasional human the others caught. Sunny was about 5 inches over 4 feet with long blonde hair that no one had decided to cut, and laced in it was large white bird feathers. Adorning his pointed ears were several types of earrings, some were studs they had picked off of human males, and some dangling earrings that he had taken from a female shaman. He also had taken her many necklaces and beads, bracelets and anklets, all of which he wore, since she had no longer needed them, being dinner and all. He enjoyed the way the trinkets felt against his sensitive skin, which was a gentle golden peach. Ka had once said that he looked like what humans often called angels, some curious winged human. He always felt a sort of disdain when they mentioned how human he looked. Sure, there was an uncanny resemblance between him and humans, but he was sure it would be only a matter of time before he started taking on the characteristics of the pack. Surely they started out looking human too. At the moment he sat high in a tree, munching agitatedly on peppermint leaves, which he had an obsession with since he could remember. Soren often teased him, calling him a cow because he was always chewing on something, which was usually peppermint leaves. After a time Sunny had lost patience with the taunting and simply replied that he didn't want his mouth smelling like a dead animal like his was. Soren had beaten him up after that remark, but hadn't called him a cow since. It seemed that out of the group, he was the only one that bathed regularly, since Crick had taught him how to do it. When he noticed that the others spent little or no time by streams and rivers like he did, he questioned why he was the only one that bathed. Ka had stated, in a rather quiet voice, that his flesh had a tendency to gather dirt quickly and give off an odor that alerted prey and was bothersome to their noses. To test this, he stopped bathing for a week until he found himself offensive and went to soak in a pond. So why was he so different from the others, yet held some characteristics that seemed human? Spade had once told him that when he was real small, he used to urinate in crap like the humans do when they were terrified, but after this change he supposedly went through, he stopped doing that. If only humans and animals needed to do such things, why had he done them in the first place? Sunny rubbed red-rimmed eyes and grunted in agitation. He always got testy when it was time for resting, something he hated to do. He'd always make such a big fuss until he managed to sit down and be still. Crick once told him that before the change, he would sleep like the humans would, for hours and hours, Crick said, and that, perhaps why he always became agitated just before resting, was because his body remembered that it used to sleep and no longer could partake of that. So had he started out human? Why had he suddenly changed? Brushing some strands of hair out of his face, Sunny took a deep breath and allowed the resting to take hold. Spade had said that before the change, resting had been dangerous for them, since they were forced to spend more time on the ground due to his clumsiness. When they rested, their bodies relaxed completely, and though they were aware of their surroundings, they were often slow to react to things, or even at all. That's why they spent resting periods high up in thick trees, hidden by foliage. Their brown skin helped them blend in with their wooden habitat, but Sunny was like a beacon, with his gentle golden skin and flowing blonde tresses that attracted human and animal alike. So he often chose the tallest, thickest trees to rest in. Resting only comes once a week and would last for only about 6 hours. At first, it was impossible for him to sit still for 10 minutes, let alone 6 hours straight. Resting had started out as a miserable ordeal until he could manage to blank his mind, or at least occupy it with thoughts that entertained him for 6 hours. Sunny's mouth stopped chewing on his mashed up peppermint leaves, and his lids began to feel heavy. He slumped on the branch and became still. Far below him sat a mound of dirt that held a large colony of ants. His eyesight was sharp, and even from the height he could still see the individual insects. Ants were spicy and a hassle to eat, and they had a habit of biting him when he attempted to munch on them. Wonder what it's like being an ant. Where are you guys going? Sunny asked, curious as to why Crick had suddenly moved them far south from their usual hunting area. He was 7 now, 3 inches taller than when he was 5, and dying to prove himself and make up for all those years, he had been a burden to the pack. Crick turned and glanced at him. Soon it will be time to teach you how to hunt bigger animals, and even humans, since you have the talent for the lure. We're going to scout the area. Stay here and behave. Sunny grimaced and leaped from one tree to the next, disappearing from view. It was easy for them to marvel at how deceptive Sunny's body was. It seemed the body of a child, soft and thin, with very little muscle. But his fragile legs managed to launch him great distances, and those thin fingers had a grip of steel. Crick had been relieved when Sunny stopped producing waste, and even more pleased when he had been licking some scratches off Sunny's back and found that his blood burned his tongue. That was when he had started teaching Sunny how to bathe himself. After the death of that human female healer, they had taken some of its belongings and had stripped the clothing so Sunny could wear them like a loincloth. Sunny had taken to the idea well and often adorned himself the silly human clothing when they had humans in their possession. What really intrigued the leader was the ever-growing source that circulated through Sunny's body. He was fascinated with it, could smell the massive potential that lurked within the youth. Crick had once asked him if it bugged him not to use the source, but Sunny had stated that at times he would feel stuffed or stretched, but then it would go away. Crick had sat through a resting to puzzle it out and arrived with the conclusion that in reality, all the unused source would build up in Sunny's channels, and then the channels would stretch or become bigger to accommodate the steady increase. It was obvious that Sunny would soon have to start using the source before he exploded or something else unfortunate. But how to teach what he knew little about? Only the master demons controlled the source, lesser ones like he and his pack did not even possess such a thing. But humans did. He had seen the dangerous ones kill each other with it, using strange hand movements and creating such powerful attacks. Sunny had so much of it. He would have to find some way to teach him. Teaching Sunny the lure had proved to be too easy, for the youth had a natural talent for such things. They had originally discovered his talent on the night of a full moon, when the sky was full of its bright light and the stars basked in its glory. Sunny had been acting strange that day, seeming sluggish and lazy. For a time, they had thought he was falling into a resting, but the only strenuous thing he could have possibly done was brawl playfully with Spade, nothing that could cause an early resting. "What's the matter, Sunny?" Spade asked a question that even Sorn was curious to know. Sunny glanced at him dully, rubbing a pointed ear, and heaved a sigh as he followed the pack through the trees. "Nothing," he replied, then heaved another sigh. "It's nothing really." Soren shrugged at Ka, and they continued on, following Crick as they moved onto a new location. It was never smart to stay in one place for long, and they often moved at least once a week to keep the game fresh. Traveling through trees kept the trail incognito, except to the ones that held the source. They tended to choose trees for stealthy retreats or chases. At night Sunny did not join them for hunting, choosing to wander off, running his thin fingers through his hair, something he did when he was agitated, and chewed on his ever-present peppermint leaves. "Not hungry, Sunny?" Ka asked in his quiet voice. Though Sunny was more demon than human, there was always something fragile about him, something about his infancy that would make them always worry about his well-being. Sunny glanced back and gave a wan smile before disappearing into the foliage. "Maybe he is changing again?" Spade inquired, blinking large yellow eyes at Crick, who was munching away at a small toad he had picked up. Crick glanced at him and nodded, too preoccupied with the thoughts of a leader to pay much attention. They continued on for some time, sniffing out the scent of wolves while hunting. Then it came, floating through the air like a sweet aroma, like the sound of bells, like if the very sky was singing. The pack stopped its hunt and froze, listening to the light sound, basking in the peace, security, and comfort of it. And it was hard to ignore the seducing call. "What is that?" Soren demanded quietly, nostrils flaring and staring unblinkingly into the foliage. "More like who is that?" Ka muttered as he stalked through the brush in the direction in which Sunny had gone. "It is beautiful," Spate whispered as he followed behind him. Moments later they entered a clearing and gasped at the figure that danced and writhed in the moonlight, pale skin glowing, hands outstretched and beckoning, hair flowing and spinning. Sunny was singing, using the lure to call out to the moon. His lure was different from any they could produce, for it was light and without the drone they used, and had little subliminal messaging since the sound alone was enough to attract attention. With his second set of vocal cords, he harmonized with the first so that it sounded like two children were singing instead of one. Sunny twirled on the ball of his left foot and danced across the clearing, staring up at the face of the moon. It was then that they noticed that his eyes had returned to that shade of blue he used to have before the change, yet it glowed, reflecting the soft light that was graced upon him. The pack watched in awe as Sunny danced and sang in the clearing, eyes riveted on the moon. "Maybe he's some type of wolf demon, since he seems enamored by the moon," Ka murmured. Sunny turned to them in mid-leap and smiled. "Come dance with me," he beckoned, then tilted his head at the sound of howling wolves in the distance. "No," Soren snapped. "The rest of us want to eat. You go on and play like the baby you are." Spate rolled his eyes in annoyance. Ever since Sunny had aged enough for him to taunt, Soren had moved from annoying Spate to bullying Sunny. Sunny stopped dancing, but the smile remained in his face. Soon he would have to teach Soren a lesson. But not tonight. Tonight was for dancing, for drinking in the light that the moon was giving, and enjoying the fresh night air. Let them hunt, he thought. I will worship the great mistress in the sky. Taking Sunny near a small village, the pack told him to sing and lure certain humans toward them. Sunny had raised his small hands to the sky and sang out clearly, his voice drifting across the wind like a fresh breeze. Several humans had stopped their labors when the angelic voice had hit their ears. The pack had eaten well, but was forced to leave soon after, when a large group of humans had come to find out where several of their own had gone. Crick studied 10-year-old Sunny, who was sitting on a sturdy branch and trying to pull a glob of sticky tree sap from his hair, which had now reached his calves. The hair was dirty and too troublesome to clean on a daily basis. "Here, Sunny," Crick called helpfully and handed over one of the small sharp weapons some humans carried with them. "Use this to cut out the sap." Sunny's red eyes fell on him, and the youth smiled toothily, white teeth flecked with mashed-up peppermint leaves. "Okay," he said cheerfully and began to artlessly hack away at the gob of damaged hair. "Might as well cut all of it out, eh?" he said conversationally and began to grab the rest of his hair and sever the strands ruthlessly. Several of the large feathers that had been lodged in his hair fell lazily to the forest floor. Crick stared up at him thoughtfully before broaching the subject that he had been pondering for some years now. "Sunny?" Remember how I asked you about the source some time ago? Sunny stuck the metal object into the trunk of the tree and began to pull loose strands of hair from his now wild and chin-length hair, all the while giving Crick a puzzled yet thoughtful gaze. Yeah, I remember. You wanted to know if it bugged me not to use it. Crick nodded, pleased that Sunny had better memory than he had surmised. Yes, that's it. Don't you want to know how to use it? Sunny stopped pulling on his hair and gave his undivided attention, his throat already making the rhythmic clicking noise associated with curiosity. He even stopped chewing, which showed that he was truly interested in what Crick had to say. Use it? Why would I care to do that? Crick pulled himself up into the tree, grateful that Sunny always chose the biggest and roomiest ones. At 7.5 feet tall, some trees had a hard time concealing the pack. He settled on a thick branch near Sunny and began to talk in a low conspirator voice, knowing that talking in such a way would keep Sunny's 10-year-old interest. It is the source that makes some humans dangerous to us. It is why we often have to move around so much so that those humans do not come after us. Sunny had stopped clicking and was now frowning. If our kind had the source, we could be invincible. We could eat anything and not have to move around so much. He put on a wistful facial expression, as if this was what made life so horrible. Alas, we do not have such power. But you do, Sunny, and if you could learn to use it, why, our pack would be indestructible. Okay, so he was laying it on a bit thick, but he was appealing to Sunny's sense of duty to the pack. Sunny was always trying to prove his usefulness to the pack and had been ecstatic when he had proved useful for the lure. But, if he had the source, something not even Crick had, he could use it to smack Zorn in the face. He'd be even better than Zorn, who was always teasing him and saying mean things. Sunny beamed at the leader. Okay. Teach me how to use the source. I'll learn it fast. Alright, Crick said with a wave of his massive hand, then settled back on the branch to think of a way to begin to teach Sunny to harness something he had no experience in. He mentally went over times he had seen humans use the source, how they leaped from trees, and often hung upside down from their feet. That took control. He glanced at the demon child who was practically bouncing on his branch with barely contained excitement. Alright. Here's what I want you to do. Can you feel the source running through you? Sunny stopped bouncing and closed his eyes. Oh, he could feel the source alright. It was always there, always ready to be used, and yet always patient, ready but waiting. Yep, I can feel it. Okay, Crick said as he jumped down from the tree and looked up at him. I want you to take some of that source and direct it toward your feet. Immediately he felt that hair-raising heat and malice fill the air, and suddenly Sunny was tossed upwards, slamming viciously through the tree, crashing through thick branches until he was airborne, above the tree. For a second, he seemed to float, before falling back down, breaking cracked branches and trying to grab one. Crick grimaced as Sunny crashed into the branch-strewn floor with a thud, leaves and other unlucky branches falling on and around him. When the commotion ended, leaves stopped falling, he eyed his young charge, who lay motionless on the forest floor. Next time, let me finish. Sunny lifted his head and grimaced, before slowly sitting up and twisting his head to release pent-up muscles and cracks in his neck. He slowly got to his feet and began to do a systems check, twiddling his fingers and toes, wriggling his arms and legs, turning his torso here and there to make sure his spine hadn't received any damage. The damage was all superficial, cuts and scrapes that had healed long before he had returned to his feet. He was much dirtier now, only a few baths would get rid of all the tree sap that now littered his flesh and attracting dirt. Sunny scowled down at an ankle that was missing its beaded anklet that he liked, then Crick rolled his eyes as Sunny went digging through the clutter of broken branches in search of the little sack that was always at his waist that held all his cultivated peppermint leaves. When the youth had found both anklet and leaf pouch and had tied them to their respected places, he then turned to Crick and smiled. Was I supposed to fly into the air like that? No. Crick replied flatly. Oh, Sunny replied, looking crestfallen. Then a smile appeared, one so bright and innocent that it almost seemed as if there had been a cloud covering the sun, and at the smile the sun had pulled from behind it. Sunny's hair shone, his red eyes sparkled, his pink pouty lips pulled into a grin. But that was cool, huh? That could get real useful later on, huh? Crick sent him a thoughtful gaze. True, actually. Keep that one in mind. But what I wanted was for you to stick onto the branch, not launch yourself from it. Come, let's find another tree to work on, since you broke this one. We have a lot of work to do with your source control. Come along, Sunny. Sunny popped a few peppermint leaves into his mouth and bounced cheerfully after the pack leader. This was going to be fun. Over the next few weeks, Sunny learned to hang upside down from trees, climb trees without using his hands, leap even farther distances, and on a more exciting discovery, make the source turn into visible red-clawed hands. That one was fun, and he had captured a rogue wolf with them once. He liked how it felt to use large amounts of the source, like some hidden pressure was finally being released. He even felt lighter. Every day he and Crick had used the source, learning to control it, trying to learn what it could and couldn't do. He hadn't seen Spade, Tka, or Tsorn since the first day Crick had approached him, and he missed playing with Spade or sitting quietly with Tka and conversing about trivial things. And Tsorn. Well, how do you feel, Sonny? Weak. Energetic. Crick sniffed his hair as if somehow he felt it reflected on the way he smelled. It actually did, but Sonny spent so much time eating peppermint leaves that was all he smelled like. It was easy to tell where Sonny was, or where he had been, by the fresh minty scent that he gave off at all times. Sonny stopped intertwining new feathers into his chin-length hair and sent a puzzled look his way. I feel light. I think I used up a lot of the source. He hesitated, then spoke again. You know, Crick, the source only seems to enhance things I already know how to do on my own. I mean, I can climb trees without using my hands, I can leap great distances and run real fast. I mean, the only thing I can't do on my own is the source hands. Beyond that I see no point. He stopped at the pained sigh Crick sent his way. Sonny, he sighed again. You've never seen any of the source carrying humans. They do great things with their source, things you cannot even begin to imagine. I would show you, but it would be too dangerous for you. Maybe when you are older and more powerful, I will show you the reason why we stay away from the source carrying humans. He ruffled Sonny's hair. In the meantime, make sure you keep control of the source. Let's head back to the pack. No doubt they miss you. Sonny nodded and tugged absently on one of his dangling earrings before following after his leader. The stone shinobi watched in silence as the man wept, grasping the bones to his chest, tears cascading down his weathered face. He'd sold everything he owned to find his daughter and had despaired when his late wife's friends had given up years ago. But he had been lucky. Many people had started missing in 3s and 4s, so that even the daimyo had taken notice. It was only a matter of time before he had heard the news that a group of shinobi had a mission to find and eliminate the cause for the missing villagers, and after hours of begging, they had allowed him to tag along. The body has been here for some time. How long ago did you say your daughter went missing? Bikezo wiped his face and stopped his sobbing. He stood up and gazed down at the scattered bones in the cave. The only way he was able to recognize that this was in fact her body was that one discarded skeletal arm held a bracelet he had made for her on her 15th birthday. 7 years. She's been missing 7 years. Who would kill her like this? He whispered. The shinobi glanced at him then each other. Well, Sagara Kitaro, Anbu's squad leader said, you've found your daughter. We're going on to the other leads. Perhaps it is time for you to go back to your village and properly mourn your loss. No. Takezo cried. I will not rest until I avenge what has been done here. The others looked at their leader. Kitaro sighed and scratched his head. Okay. Just don't be a burden. Takezo nodded. He knew he had long since stopped being a burden. Pure determination alone had honed his muscles, taught him to be quick. His job in the squad was information gathering. He often spent it in the villages, asking families about the last time they had seen their sons and daughters, husbands and wives. He now knew what happened to his daughter. Did the others meet the same fate? The ones who had done this to his Yumi would pay. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If yes, then make sure to drop 2 red and a blue heart to show your love. See you in the next part.